The following is a presentation of Appalachian State University.
On May the 12th of 2008, the world learned of a natural disaster of an unimaginable scale as a 7.9 magnitude earthquake hit China's Sichuan province and killed more than 71,000 people. The earthquake occurred as a group of 11 Appalachian students and faculty were traveling through China studying religion, history, and culture. Led by Bob White, Executive Director of Appalachian's Office of International Education and Development, the group was in a temple in Chengdu when the earthquake occurred. We'll talk with Bob White about this intriguing story coming up on Appalachian Perspective. Welcome to Appalachian Perspective. My guest today is Bob White, Executive Director of Appalachian's Office of International Education and Development. Bob, thank you for joining us today. It's great to have you here. Let's get right to the story. You were there. Where were you at the time the earthquake occurred? How close to the center? What were you doing at that time?
Our group had been in China for about a week of a planned 3 weeks, Ken, and we were in Chengdu. The day's activity focused on a visit. Our primary goal that day was twofold, actually. We went first to the poet's cottage, so-called of Du Fu, a Tang-era poet of some renown. He is akin to their William Shakespeare. And we spent a delightful morning talking about Chinese tradition and its cultural inheritance. And to expand on that, we wanted to move from the secular into the spiritual, and we had planned an afternoon in the largest extant Taoist temple complex in western China. It was founded during the Tang Dynasty by Master Wang, and we were in the complex. We'd been there about an hour or so and visited several of the nearly 30 temple facilities, and as fate would have it, at 2:38, I believe it was, on the 12th, most of the group, there were one or two that were outside, but most of the group of us were inside the temple dedicated to Master Wang. The Chinese say that it's a 1,000-year-old building. It might only be 800 years, but nonetheless, it's an astonishing edifice. And we were scattered through the temple, and I first heard a noise that I thought was every pigeon in the park being flushed at once. It was sort of noise like that. But then I realized that was not what it was, and I thought, my heavens, it's a massive windstorm. And just as I was realizing to myself that the building was in fact moving, Dr. Sean Arthur, who was with me from our Philosophy and Religion Department, yelled out, "Earthquake," and we all ran outside. And the next 2.5 minutes or so were astonishing moments in my life. The paving stones were moving like this with no rhythm. I went down on one knee and leaned against my walking stick so I could stay upright. The birds were flying in crazy circles in the air. No one was shouting or screaming, and the amazing thing to me was I have never in my life heard about the sound of an earthquake. And I've struggled for 2.5 months to try to find the right way to describe that. It was a low rumble that was visceral. You could feel it in your stomach. You could feel it against the back of your belly. You could feel it in your spine. But it wasn't loud and piercing like a rock concert, but it was all pervasive. And as I sat there watching this 1,000-year-old building move literally sideways, up, down, back and forth, and not fall, it says something for the flexibility of traditional building styles, I had the funny thought that I should be true to my good colleague Fred Webb, a retired fellow here from ASU. We were in a Chinese language class 25 years ago, and there was a loud thump in Sanford Hall. And Fred commented, "Oh, 2:38 on a Tuesday afternoon, a 1.2 magnitude earthquake in Boone, North Carolina." And I thought I should be a good geologist, and so I started counting. And I counted to 1,193 before it quit. And it seemed like an eternity. We were able to see each other, and most of the students were on one side, and I was glad of that. No one was in the building, I knew that, but I was really worried about a couple of our students who weren't in sight. One doesn't, I am yet trying to be totally reflective about this. Dr. Arthur and I are writing up our reflections, and we hope to publish either an article or perhaps a small book about the events. And the more I write, the more I realize that I was, in fact, thinking about the impact of it as well as reacting to it and understanding that I was in something I've never experienced in my life. When the shaking stopped, we immediately tried to reconnoiter, and we found the other 2 students on the other side of the building, thankfully. But that 2.5 minutes seemed like an eternity. And the amazing thing was that no one was hurt. I mean, we were immediately thankful that there was no one in our immediate group that was hurt. And we spent quite some time, well, the next 4 days trying to get out of the city of Chengdu because, in effect, we were in the way. The entire city was stretched to the limits in terms of its response. It's the capital of Sichuan province there in western China. And we were to learn just how dramatic all of that had been. But when the thing started, we were, very ironically, in the temple to the master of Taoism, whose edifice has been there for most of the last millennium. And we have talked repeatedly about how fortunate we were to be perhaps under his hand,
right,
in some ways, to be in that very safe spot of sanctuary at the moment that thing happened. And of course, as the world has learned, the earthquake was one of the 3 biggest ones in the last century. The previous one in 1976 preceded the death of Mao Zedong, and of course that fits very, very neatly into Chinese history and tradition. Natural catastrophe of this type is generally seen as a precursor to some sort of bigger event. Perhaps it will be the good effects of the Beijing Olympics. I certainly hope so.
Yes.
But I had that thought, and as we were to learn, it had been a massive, massive, massive natural disaster. I have to say that that's as close as anything on that scale that I ever want to be close
Certainly.
to. I have learned quite a lot through the self-reflection and conversation with our students, who were brilliant, and my colleague, Dr. Arthur, who was a partner in leading the trip.
Teach me something about what you said Dr. Webb had said. You count from 1 to what number?
I counted 1001, 1002, up to 1093. So this thing lasted over 2 minutes, maybe not quite 3. I'm not sure if I was being as precise as some might be, but it seemed an eternity. It seemed an eternity.
I'm sure it did. The temple, you said, though, it stood.
Yes.
Was there damage, though?
Yes, there was damage. There's a big concrete spine along the top of it's a traditional Chinese building style, and the gable of the roof goes out and then curves up into swooping architectural style that we all recognize if we look at Chinese architecture, and that had a big split in it. But the wooden timber frame, all mortised and tenon, withstood the earthquake and did very well. And in fact, it became a place of refuge in the wake of the quake. 2 students and I sat for about 15 or 20 minutes. There were several older Chinese who got together, and they began a conversation that I caught much of, not its entirety, but the conversation focused on what this meant for China's immediate future. And they were comparing it to the Tangshan earthquake of '76 and another earthquake that had taken place in Sichuan back in 1933. The oldest of them was saying, we need to pay attention to this. These are natural occurring things, and we should be prepared for them and not be surprised. And he was sort of preaching to his younger colleagues and to us on the sidelines as we listened. It was really quite fascinating.
When you got outside, you said someone shouted the word earthquake and you went outside. What was it like in the streets? And were other buildings, were they as fortunate in terms of withstanding all of that than what the temple was?
Well, Ken, the amazing thing was that we were extraordinarily lucky, as we were to find out over the course of the next 3 or 4 days. We didn't know the impact immediately, and we didn't leave the temple complex for about 2 hours. We decided that it would be best to stay until we heard word from someone. Obviously, something major had happened. But Chengdu was lucky. There were a number of deaths and injuries from things that fell, but no buildings that collapsed in Chengdu itself. But we were a mere 50 miles as the crow flies away from the epicenter of the thing. And in fact, geologically speaking, to refer back to the thoughts that I had about Fred as I responded to all this, we were scheduled to be at Wudongjie the very next day, which was the center of all of this. And there would have been quite a different story had that happened. And of course, one day, geologically speaking, is not even a bare whisper of time. if that thing had just waited 24 hours, we would have been in the center of it. As it was, and I hope I can unfold this story in the next little bit, the damage in Chengdu itself was not massive so that you could see it as having been in the center of something. But as we left the compound, it became clear that a major event had happened, that there were quite a number of injuries, in fact. What we did in the wake of the quake, we looked around, and I frankly expected to be ushered right out and back to our hotel by authorities, but one can get a sense of the degree to which everybody was thrown off of this. There was no cell service. And we found out in short order that the landline system was working, but sporadically, and of course we had no access to that. There are no public telephones. There was never a history of public payphones like we had here. Phone use was limited in China until the advent of the cell phones. There was no internet and no cell phones, so everyone was confused about what to do next. So we retreated to the place where all the Chinese went. There was a tea house in the temple grounds, and we went and had tea. They had propane burners, and that was the only thing that was available, so we had several cups of tea, all of us, being careful not to walk under eaves and listening to the remarks about being cautious and safe and staying away from buildings. And the first sort of official thing that happened was that the monks closed all the buildings. And I don't know if they got a call from the government. We learned later that day that all buildings in the city had been closed. The first official action that we saw were the monks going around closing the doors and scooting everybody that was still in any of the temple complex buildings to the outside. So the tea house is an open courtyard, and we went there and we had tea for the next couple of hours. Then over that time, there was a growing crescendo of noise outside of this, it's maybe 50 or 75 acre complex in the middle of Chengdu, and siren noise grew increasingly, and the noise of people, not traffic, but people grew. And after about an hour and a half, we decided it was time for us to go and try to make our way back to our hotel. And when we left the compound, that's when we really got a sense of how devastating all this was when we went on the outside.
But you never lost contact with the students, so they were you never worried about them. They were right there with you the whole time.
We found each other within 2 or 3 minutes after the thing was over. Our group was together. We were, and the way the trip was constructed, that was the plan. Leading study abroad, as you know, is just well, it's a wonderful privilege to go to the place that you love and you devote your academic career to, and then to take students into the center of all that is just a great joy. And so what we would do, we would hold class. We would walk about and let them examine the symbols and think about what Sean and I had talked about in our classes with them, and then we would get together and we would reflect, and then we would do another class. And usually each place that we visited was punctuated by class, free time, class, free time. And we had just finished a conversation about a lot of the symbolic presentation that we were seeing about Taoism, about the Chinese cosmology and the way they perceive the great spiritual world. And so we were very fortunate in that we were very close together.
Bob, you've been to China for many times and many international trips, but this one was different. What do you think our students might have learned from this experience being in China during this?
Ken, the ironic thing is we had set our program up with Sean as the expert on traditional cosmology and me the commentator on recent history, revolutionary history. But what we wanted to really show them was the real China. And I say that against the context that you are very familiar with. You and I have collaborated for 20 years plus on our good friends across the Pacific. And they've achieved nothing short of a modern miracle in terms of their development. The 10% growth a year for the last 20 years is a growth at a level that no one else in the world has ever sustained for that period. But I wanted to see past that. I wanted them to see Chinese being Chinese, and not the Chinese on a world stage being, yes, Chinese, but world citizens in a different way. We'd hoped to introduce the students to a real China, if you will. Perhaps a grandiose desire in a 3.5-week, 4-week summer study abroad program, but nonetheless that was our goal. And ironically, the earthquake gave us the chance for that to happen. you know that the Chinese are as enamored of their cell phones as we are,
Mm-hmm.
and you will often see people with two holsters, one in each hand, doing business in the modern way just as fast as they can. Well, when the earthquake struck, cell phone service stopped.
Mm-hmm.
Internet was down. We had no access to landlines. There was a landline there at the facility, but the director was on it, and I don't know if there was a second one. And so everybody was thrown off of modernity, if you will, and thrown back on the old face-to-face communications and face-to-face interactions that so define any society. And I think the students, who I salute, our students were brilliant, by the way. Every one of them acted in a mature, responsible way against the frustration of losing this central element week of their trip. And they helped us to help ourselves get out of the way and move on to the next portion of the thing. But I think they saw China operating where goodness and benevolence and the well-being of all is really at the center. You know, China was never a place where the individual was touted in ways that we are in the West. It was really more about the collective good opportunity and operation of society for everyone. And of course, there are great philosophical differences in those two approaches, but the beauty of China is that it did that in that particular way for 2 millennium. And watching a response like this, the national response to this earthquake opened that door for the students.
Did you shorten your time in the Sichuan province, or did you?
No, and in fact, it took us most of 4.5, 5 days to get out of Sichuan. As I told you a bit ago, we stayed in the temple complex for a couple of hours. The saga after we left really is worth remarking on. We left the temple, and the minute we stepped out the temple gate, it was clear that something massive and untoward had happened. There was no traffic on the streets. Everybody was on the streets. Chengdu is a city of some 8 or 9 million, I believe I'm correct on that, and everyone had been ordered out of the buildings by the government. So the streets were packed.
Yeah.
It took our bus driver at a dead slow crawl 15 minutes just to get out of the parking lot. And then you couldn't negotiate the streets with any rapidity because bicycles were filling them. The occasional bus would cause not just a jam at the bus stop, but for 100 feet around the bus as people tried to get on public transportation to go home. And we were maybe in normal traffic a 15-minute ride from our hotel. It took us about 2 hours to get back to the hotel. And during that time, we passed through the center city square. I have only seen on video the large Red Guard mass movements during the Cultural Revolution when literally 1 million people would be in Tiananmen Square. And I don't think the central city square in Chengdu was that full, but it was close. I mean, it was packed. And I knew that there had been a lot of injury when we passed a hospital, and all of the gurneys, all of the beds, all of the stretchers were filled, and every white uniformed and suited doctor and nurse and medical person was there, and people were being carried in on the backs of friends, on stretchers with bloodied turbans, and we saw the first of the bodies that we saw. There were several hundred people killed in Chengdu by falling debris, and again, we were very, very, very lucky to be where we were. And we eventually made our way back to the hotel. We were not allowed to go in the hotel, but rather told to go to a big open space, so we joined the crowd in the center city square, which is only about 2 blocks away from the hotel, and took up seats there close to the big Mao statue. There's a big white Mao statue with his hand held out. You're familiar with the pose they put him in. And I got into a conversation with an older gentleman, and I had to laugh. He said, "Well, cell phones aren't working. The police don't seem to know what to do. The government's just ordered us to leave our buildings and our homes." He said, "I think Chairman Mao might step down off of his statue and wrap us up in his arm." He was being wistful and optimistic and hopeful. But we stayed there for about an hour until there were a couple of aftershocks, and then we retreated back to our hotel. And we were very lucky. They let us go in and gather our belongings. And then we got on the bus that we had engaged and headed south and out of the city to a place where we found sanctuary for the night. Miracle number one was surviving the earthquake without any harm. Miracle number two really occurred that night. We found a hotel near the panda breeding reserve, which is south of town. And although they would rent us a hotel room, they wouldn't let us stay in it because of the government directive to stay outside. So we joined 10 million people in an enforced camporee in Chengdu. Everybody was preparing to sleep on the streets, and we did the same thing. We gathered up our bedding and chair pillows, and on covered walkways in an absolutely delightful garden, we made our beds for the night. And so I camped out in China, something I've never done before. And our thought was that we could be under the covered walkway, and a gentle rain had started to fall. And we were not in the direct rain, unlike many, 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 many hundreds of thousands of people who had only, tarps and umbrellas and all that sort of thing. So the second miracle of the day was that we found a place to sleep.
How long and what way did you get confirmation of the earthquake?
Well, the really interesting thing was when I got in contact was the method I chose. I use 21st century technology, but we chose to send a text message not to Pat, not to Meg, Pat my wife, not to Meg, not to Jessie, but to my youngest daughter, who I knew would be checking her cell phone, whatever, for a text message. Not my oldest daughter. I don't know that she uses it as much. So we sent a very brief text message to my youngest daughter that we were okay. And then the next afternoon, I managed to get on internet for a little bit and send a longer message that I think some of it made its way into the news networks around campus and then locally.
Well, the news networks you mentioned, sometimes we don't get the whole story over here about what's happening in China. How was this? Did we get the story? You're here now, so you know.
Well, and Ken, that's the way we found out how massive this was. Two things. Number one, what we observed and what the world observed in the wake of the earthquake was something absolutely unprecedented. The People's Republic of China has not been noted for absolute openness of its media, and for all the reasons, right, wrong, and otherwise, that historians and political scientists and communication experts and folks who do business would have it otherwise or not have it otherwise. The fact is that it's a closed society, and events like this we often don't, or major events, I should say, we often don't hear about. Disagreements with the government, that kind of thing. This earthquake prompted something that, as a student of modern China, as a student of propaganda and the means of education used particularly by the communists during the Civil War and then during the establishment of New China, what the world saw was really unprecedented. How unprecedented? We quickly, like everybody else in China, became glued to the television screens whenever we were around one, because they were showing live, unedited, 24-hour-a-day footage of the earthquake. You would see young reporters who were obviously from well-accoutered TV stations. They had all the right equipment, but they'd walk up to four-star generals who were directing traffic, rescue operations, recovery operations, and they would start asking questions. And instead of putting them off, the four-star general would turn to them and start answering. The Army had been, and all of the relief organizations had been instructed by the government to be totally honest and open with the media. And what the world saw that first 2 or 3 weeks, I'm not sure how long it remained this open, is really unprecedented. And in fact, we saw a lot of things on Chinese television that would probably never be aired on American television. Some of the more horrendous of the rescue scenes and the pictures of the devastation and death. I don't think that a lot of that would remain unedited on American television. So the world saw what was going on. And then the other thing that it allowed for us to see and allowed for us to try and deal with and weave into our study abroad trip was the nature of that unparalleled response and the window into China that it gave us. And we spent several hours, like most of the Chinese, watching events unfold and being both saddened and uplifted by moments of heroic, or a rescue or survival. We joined all of China, and particularly all of the Sichuanese, in trying to figure out what was going on and realizing just how fortunate we'd been to be as far away from the epicenter as we were.
But 71,000 people plus reported dead. How does the culture deal with that? What did you see? What did you feel And I can't imagine what that was like.
Ken, I was torn between wishing that someone else was on this hot seat but me, because we're never prepared to deal with calamity like that. The overwhelming human response to learning that a middle school with 700 or 800 children had just been snuffed out. Their lives had been snuffed out. Like the astonishing human care that was being lavished on everyone involved. You may remember Professor Yang De-Yo, who was with us for about 3 years. I got a call on a cell phone that had been given to me by our travel vendor. I don't know how he found my number. He is in Chengdu province. He called me, it was the middle of day 3, I think, to express his concern and urged me to be careful and cautious and to call on him if there was anything that he could do. The outreach, human outreach, was stunning. I mean, by day 2, people had set up collection boxes for relief on the sidewalks. The young man who was our local agent on the ground was a Red Cross member and was already talking about leaving as soon as he managed to get us out of the city to go and volunteer to help. There was a massive, massive, massive outpouring of human concern that was really touching. And it made my own concern for the angst that the safety of my small group was causing me. It seemed small in comparison, and yet as crucial to me as it was for everyone else. And so those things all mixed up in an incredible emotional, uplifting sense of what we can do when we're pressed. The government was there to do everything it could. We saw one line of trucks that must have been 10 miles long on the way with relief. And we saw these collection boxes form immediately. And what we faced was the great difficulty of trying to get out of the way. I called the U.S. consulate there, and I talked about 5 minutes about our safety, and the fellow said, well, thank you. And I said, for what? He said, well, A, for reporting in. He said, but B, for not asking us to do anything. He said, we can't get our own people in and out. Right. And he said, please touch base if anything horrific happens or you need, sort of immediate first aid. But otherwise, they were as powerless as we were. And the great heroism of the young man who was our local logistics person. He called in his partner and another young woman, and the 3 of them stayed with us for the 4 days. I don't think they slept until they got us on a boat in Chongqing and out of harm's way. And I want, in fact, I'll do this here today and with you. I intended to approach you about joining me in writing a letter of appreciation to the Szechuan Red Cross, and particularly to this young man and his. They were heroes.
Absolutely.
I mean, he had his own family. They all had their own families, their own set of things to deal with. We never asked. He stayed right with us until we bid them farewell and got on the boat to go down the river to safety. Mr. Mao Fei, I need to say his name here publicly and let him know that we're thinking about him.
Well, I really thank you for your leadership and the fact, as you said, our students actually got to see China pulling together. You and I both have seen the heart of the people of China, and sometimes our governments have their issues, but when you get to the people level, we're all good people. We care about each other, and you provided our students with that opportunity. They'll never forget that. Never in their life forget that.
And neither will I. And I mean, ASU has provided opportunities for me to be with students for a long time now, and this particular example, however, is going to stick out.
Yes.
They were.
I'm glad you were there. I'm glad you're back safe. I'm glad you were able to report it to us. So thank you again for being on the show, and thanks for all you do for Appalachian.
My pleasure,
Okay.
Ken.
Thank you.
I join you in that. You know that.
I know.